Picture this. You're in a collegiate library, somewhere between the 1890s and the 1910s, probably in Cambridge. You're studying an old document of some kind. Perhaps it's an illuminated manuscript of the 14th century, perhaps the engraving of a rare house, perhaps the papers of some long-deceased provost with occasional Latin transcripts. But as you study one part, something seems slightly off. Is it you, or has the room grown a little darker? You could swear that part of the picture had nothing in it before. There is no loud noise, no shocking jump scare, just a growing sense of dread. And as you slowly raise your head, you see someone in another part of the library close to you. Someone in dark clothing, their hand resting on one of the books. A hand that looks horrifyingly skeletal. Hello, and welcome to a spooky edition of Author Talks, where I, Thomas Wrightson, look at something which has been obsessing me in recent weeks. You may think it's the wrong time of year for ghost stories or talk of such, but I'm following the Japanese tradition of telling them in the summer, and the author I'm talking about today told his at Christmas, so there's that. That writer was M.R. James. For this script, I'll be extensively referencing both James's own essays on his work and the two-part essay by Michael Kellermeyer for Old Style Press, which provides a deeper analysis of James's work and influences. I'll be leaving links in the description. Montague Rhodes James, 1862 to 1936, is an interesting character. He was a noted medievalist scholar, a translator of Latin manuscripts, and served as provost first of King's College, Cambridge from 1905 to 1916, and then of Eton from 1913 until his death. Among his notable scholarly and university duties were discovering and translating a fragmentary manuscript which led to the excavation of several previously lost tombs of 12th century abbots in Bury St Edmunds, detailed yet accessible writings on church architecture and ecclesiastic history, and expanding the painting and manuscript holdings of Fitzwilliam Museum during his time there as director. Altogether, a distinguished if not spectacular academic career. But if you know M.R. James for anything, it's his ghost stories. He's been called a founder of modern folk horror, and influenced a number of writers in the horror genre in the century and change since his stories first began publication. I vaguely heard of him in disconnected bits and pieces until about 2 years ago, when I encountered the radio drama Echoes from the Abbey. This 1984 production, written by Sheila Hodgson, was based on a fragment left behind by James of a story he never fully completed. The radio play featured James as the lead character, experiencing a ghostly happening similar to his stories, and is part of a series written by Hodgson based on similar ideas, half-written concepts, and fragments created by James, with James cast as the lead. Eventually, I encountered the real thing, and let me just say that while Hodgson's interpretations of James's ideas are good, they're nothing compared to the original work. I'll lay out why that is going forward, highlight some issues people may find with his writing today, then I'll finish off with what I think is the perfect introduction to James as a story writer. I must preface this by saying that if you're looking for long-form James content, if his short stories pique your interest, you'll have to go to his scholarly work. The only fiction he produced was short ghost stories, a few thousand words each. As he stated in an essay, he had never cared to try any other kind. The stories, 36 in total, were first told to his friends and students at the university each Christmas, and eventually published in magazine and book form between 1895 and 1935. To best introduce some of his thematic preferences with these stories, I'll be quoting from him, first from the preface of his second published compilation of the stories. I think that as a rule, the setting should be fairly familiar, and the majority of the characters and their talk such as you may meet or hear any day. A ghost story of which the scene is laid in the 12th or 13th century may succeed in being romantic or poetical. It will never put the reader into the position of saying to himself, if I'm not careful, something of this kind may happen to me. Another requisite, in my opinion, is that the ghost should be malevolent or odious. Amiable and helpful apparitions are all very well in fairy tales or in local legends, but I have no use for them in a fictitious ghost story. Though James is the first to admit that even he breaks or bends these rules on occasion, What are rules to writers after all? Guidelines at best and helpful restrictions at worst. The next was that he drew a number of influences from real-world locations, quoting from his original compilation, "If anyone is curious about my local settings, let it be recorded that St. Bertram de Comminges and Viborg are real places, that in O Whistle and I'll Come to You I had Felixstowe in mind. As for the fragments of ostensible erudition which are scattered about my pages, hardly anything in them is not pure invention. There never was, naturally, any such book as that which I quote in The Treasure of Abbot Thomas." Another feature of his stories, as pointed out by David Stewart Davies, was a comparative lack of explicit violence and gore. It's there, but it's not shoved in your face. Indeed, the reluctance of his lead characters to describe such things with any detail, or describe them at all, forms part of the horror. While I could wax poetic about James's style, I focus my praise down on the two things he does well: historical grounding and a recognisable sense of dread. The first was born of James's own academic and historical interests, injecting his experiences and knowledge into them. There's a reason modern stories casting James in the lead work so well, or at least are so popular. He is the storyteller, and through him we get a strong sense of place and history. Ruins and old villages come to life, historical scenes feel real. It's that aspect of familiarity he mentioned earlier regarding how he created the atmosphere of his ghost stories. Of course, his settings weren't everything, and he even commented on this grounding in his essay, Stories I Have Tried to Write. Some of his attempts, quote, refused to blossom in the surroundings I had devised for them, unquote. For the second, the dread, we can look at how he handled this in his characters' ordeals. When looking at his characters and the dread they are subjected to, it might seem quite tame to a modern reader inured to the likes of Stephen King or Darren Shan. But it was innovative in its day, as pointed out by Kellermeyer, because it stood in stark contrast to traditional ghost stories of the Gothic period. To quote, "Very often James does use ghosts in a traditional manner, viz. That they are indeed the spirits of the dead returned to interfere in the lives of their fellows, but even in these cases they are no mere visions which passively point and wring their hands and glower, but bony, slimy perversions which slither out of their graves and clatter up to unlocked windows with murderous purposes. In any case, James's ghosts are notable for their loathsome materiality, their unreasonable drive, and their shameless lack of boundaries." James's hauntings are varied and often tangibly terrifying. Some lean into the spectacular, but rarely. They're also pretty varied. Across the stories we get, to name a few examples, inanimate objects revealing past misdeeds, rotting monsters guarding treasure, wicked men who crave immortality, and ghosts who are slightly too possessive of their territory or property. Perhaps James's two most famous stories, Casting the Runes and O Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad, feature then innovative examples of what have become pretty standard in the form. In Casting the Runes, the protagonist becomes the victim of a death curse, preceded by torments from an unseen demonic presence. Meanwhile, in O Whistle, the lead is literally haunted by the owner of a looted whistle, culminating in an encounter with possessed bed linen. Phrased like this, James can sound pretty conventional, but reading his stories in summary alone isn't the best idea. The strength comes from the writing, the slow building dread. You don't fully realise the scares of O Whistle without going through the story and sharing the lead's experiences. Similarly, a simple summary of the story The Ash Tree loses much of its kick without the two scenes featuring the tradition of drawing the sorties, a form of short-term prediction using phrases from the Bible. Those scenes, and how they foreshadow elements of the later story, form part of the ghostly atmosphere. There is some humour to be found in James's prose, often in asides about subjects that aren't entirely pertinent to the narrative, or in how some of the characters interact. But an interesting element of his work is how his tone darkened in the years during and following the First World War. Many of his darkest narratives, including An Episode of Cathedral History, A Warning for the Curious, and Wailing Well, come from this period. That's not to say they aren't worth experiencing, they are, but they do have a darker edge than one might have come to expect from the tone of his earlier tales. This isn't just retrospective opinion. Speaking about James's final short story, A Vignette, Contemporary editor Rolf Arnold Scott James asked M.R. James to try and capture the atmosphere of his first story collection. James created the story, but these were his words on his opinion of it. "I am ill satisfied with what I enclose. It comes late and is short and ill-written. There have been a good many events conspiring to keep it back, besides a growing inability. So pray don't use it unless it has some quality I do not see in it. I send it because I was enjoined to do something by Mr. Owen Smith." Suffice to say, the story was published, and I think it's worth experiencing as a good example of this later, darker period of James's writing. So far, I have heaped praise on James as a writer and storyteller, but not talked about James as a person. And that's because he was pretty private about his own life and in most ways extremely of his time. He was a product of the male-focused and male-oriented world of British academia during the 19th century, and also a product of the male-oriented mindsets of that time, from common rights to new technology to gender roles. For instance, he was averse to the broader degree access that occurred during his lifetime, and during King's College's 1895 vote on whether to offer women university degrees, he voted against the motion. Not fun fact, King's College didn't admit women until 1972. In Kellermeyer's words, he was notoriously dismissive of women, even those he admired, and a contemporary of his, A.C. Benson, said of James, "He hates and fears all problems, all speculation, all originality or novelty of view." And it's true that what writing we have of James's opinions show that he tended to lean towards the conservative and even the close-minded. Turning to criticism of his writing, which can and must be done, for one thing, the prose is very dense and verbose, as you'd expect from most writers around this time. You will be encountering huge paragraphs, more than a few run-on sentences, and sections of the story where nothing seems to happen. Some will be turned off by this, but it's a lot more readable than other similar writing from this period. I have never found myself glazing over while reading. Secondly, it is important to keep in mind the place of his work and interests in the field of antiquarian pursuits. To briefly summarise, an antiquary or antiquarian was someone who studies and is fascinated by objects from the past. That can be remains of an old abbey, a collection of Roman coins, an ancient historic chronicle, an Anglo-Saxon sword, or a Celtic carving. This isn't unique to the West, as one of the earliest examples of an antiquary can be found in Wu Yangzhu, who lived during the Song dynasty of China in the 11th century. The scope of what were antiquarian activities nowadays covers fields including the historian, the archivist, the numismatist, the philologist, and the archaeologist. Over time, the word antiquarian has gotten a pretty negative stigma due to a number of factors, from their lack of academic focus and ignorance of wider historical context, to a seeming obsession with death. To quote Horace Walpole, who was ironically something of an antiquarian himself, on the latter criticism, "Bishop Charles Littleton used to torment me with barrows and Roman camps, and I would as soon have attended to the turf graves of our churchyards. I have no curiosity to know how awkward and clumsy men have been at the dawn of arts, or in their decay." Nowadays, people have also associated the term antiquarian with the activities of some figures who got overly creative with relics and ancient sites. This isn't technically the whole truth, and there was some bleed over and conflation with the neo-pagan revival and other groups, but we'd be here all day if we started unpacking that. The antiquary also emerged at a time when Britain and most other Western countries were in the habit of yoinking artefacts from other countries without permission from the locals. But the antiquaries were still important during the time when James wrote his ghost stories, and antiquarians frequently played a role in them. There's a good reason that James titled his first compilation of ghost stories in 1904, Ghost Stories of an Antiquary. Furthermore, his work features a recurring anti-Catholic streak in some of his stories, and when it appears there is an othering of the Middle East, which, let's be honest, is still common today in the West. To balance that, he often casts aristocrats as antagonists in his stories, and unlike later similar writers such as H.P. Lovecraft, his work includes very few actual slurs. One story I read, Lost Hearts, had two of its characters use now outdated and potentially offensive terms for people like the Romani, and of course there are words such as popish and papist, which are pejoratives for the Catholic Church across multiple stories. But even with these findings, James's stories are leaps and bounds better than a lot of fiction from this time with their slew of slurs and pejoratives. Like Lovecraft. And speaking of Lovecraft, I may have to do an episode on Lovecraft at this rate, I was immediately struck by how similar their stories were in basic structure. An academic or antiquarian type getting overly curious and unleashing something dangerous or unearthing forbidden knowledge through an ancient record? Turns out I was on the money, as Lovecraft considered James's stories as some of the best ghost stories around. I wouldn't be surprised if the latter influenced the former. This praise has been echoed both among other contemporary writers and subsequent writers of horror fiction in later years. Suffice to say, James is effectively horror royalty, and his stories, despite their issues, are still worth a read. Before wrapping up, I should also highlight dramatizations. James's work has been adapted multiple times for radio, film and television. Horror aficionados may know the 1958 film Night of the Demon, the first of 2 screen adaptations of Casting the Runes. The BBC's irregular A Ghost Story at Christmas series owes all but 6 of its 19 total episodes to James's stories. But while these in particular are frequently respectful and praiseworthy adaptations, they do fall into modern horror tropes. The changed setting, sometimes more action-based finales, the twist ending not in the original, the morally objectionable lead character. Any reader of Miss Marple stories will know the similar thing we poor fans had to endure for all but one of the modern ITV productions of her stories. To take a pertinent example, I'll touch briefly on an adaptation of the story I'm going to read for you for the rest of this episode, 1904's The Mezzotint. The adaptation, released in 2021, is on the whole an excellent and atmospheric rendition of what can be a story that doesn't work well on screen. But the ending... well, I won't go into details, so I'll sum it up like this. Is it effective? Yes. Does it undermine the rest of the story? Debatably also yes. There is also the frankly outplayed tradition of casting James as the lead character in ghost stories that happened to him. Hodgson's plays are an example, of course, but also Mark Gatiss' radio play The Haunting of M.R. James or Stephen Sheridan's The House at World's End, which... I mean, I get the appeal, but I'm not a fan of planting real people in stories inspired by their work. Feels a little cheap, especially as they often play merry hell with the real chronology of James's life. But enough of that. Now you may sit back, relax, turn off the lights, light a candle, and sit to my lightly abridged reading of what I believe is one of the best introductions to the M.R. James ghost story. The Mezzotint. Some time ago, I believe I had the pleasure of telling you the story of an adventure which happened to a friend of mine by the name of Denniston during his pursuit of objects of art for the museum at Cambridge. As it turned out, even a department so homely and familiar as this may have its dark corners, and to one of these, Mr. Williams was unexpectedly introduced. Those who have taken even the most limited interest in the acquisition of topographical pictures are aware that there is one London dealer whose aid is indispensable to their researches. Mr. J. W. Britnell publishes at short intervals very admirable catalogues of a large and constantly changing stock of engravings, plans and old sketches of mansions, churches and towns in England and Wales. Now, in February of last year, there appeared on Mr. Williams's desk at the museum a catalogue from Mr. Britnell's Emporium, and accompanying it was a typewritten communication from the dealer himself. This letter ran as follows. Dear Sir, we beg to call your attention to number 978 in our accompanying catalogue, which we shall be glad to send on approval. Yours faithfully, J. W. Britnell. To turn to number 978 in the accompanying catalogue was, with Mr. Williams, the work of a moment, and in the place indicated he found the following entry. 978. Unknown. Interesting Mezzotint. View of a manor house, early part of the century. 15 by 10 inches, black frame, £2, 2 shillings. It was not specially exciting, and the price seemed high. However, as Mr. Britnell, who knew his business and his customer, seemed to set store by it, Mr. Williams wrote a postcard asking for the article to be sent on approval, along with some other engravings and sketches which appeared in the same catalogue, and so he passed without much excitement of anticipation to the ordinary labours of the day. The only item with which I am concerned was the rather large black-framed Mezzotint, of which I have already quoted the short description given in Mr. Britnell's catalogue. It was a rather indifferent Mezzotint, and an indifferent Mezzotint is perhaps the worst form of engraving known. It presented a full-face view of a not very large manor house of the last century, with 3 rows of plain sashed windows with rusticated masonry about them, a parapet with balls or vases at the angles, and a small portico at the centre. On either side were trees, and in front a considerable expanse of lawn. The legend A.W.F. Sculptist was engraved on the narrow margin, and there was no further inscription. The whole thing gave the impression that it was the work of an amateur. What in the world Mr. Britnell could mean by fixing the price of £2 2s to such an object was more than Mr. Williams could imagine. He turned it over with a good deal of contempt. Upon the back was a paper label, the left hand of which had been torn off. All that remained were the ends of 2 lines of writing. The first had the letters Ingley Hall, the second SSEX. It would perhaps be just worthwhile to identify the place represented, which he could easily do with the help of a gazetteer, and then he would send it back to Mr. Britnell with some remarks reflecting upon the judgment of that gentleman. He lighted the candles, for it was now dark, made the tea, and supplied the friend with whom he had been playing golf. It was now that the friend, let us call him Professor Binks, took up the framed engraving and said, "What's this place, Williams?" "Just what I'm going to try to find out," said Williams, going to the shelf for a gazetteer. "Look at the back. Somethingly Hall, either in Essex or Sussex. Half the name's gone, you see. You don't happen to know it, I suppose?" "It's from that man Britnell, I suppose, isn't it?" said Binks. "Is it for the museum?" "Well, I think I should buy it if the price was 5 shillings, said Williams, "but for some unearthly reason he wants 2 guineas for it. I can't conceive why. It's a wretched engraving, and there aren't even any figures to give it life." "It's not worth 2 guineas, I should think," said Binks, "but I don't think it's so badly done. The moonlight seems rather good to me, and I should have thought there were figures, or at least a figure, just on the edge in front." "Let's look," said Williams. "Well, it's true the light is rather cleverly given. Where's your figure? Oh, yes, just the head in the very front of the picture." And indeed there was. Hardly more than a black blot on the extreme edge of the engraving. The head of a man or woman, a good deal muffled up, the back turned to the spectator and looking towards the house. Williams had not noticed it before. "Still," he said, "though it's a cleverer thing than I thought, I can't spend 2 guineas of museum money on a picture of a place I don't know." Professor Binks had his work to do and soon went, and nearly up to Hall time Williams was engaged in a vain attempt to identify the subject of his picture. Hall in Mr. Williams's college was at 7. It need not be dwelt upon. I suppose an hour or more to have been spent in what is called common room after dinner. Later in the evening some few retired to William's rooms, and I have little doubt that whist was played and tobacco smoked. During a lull in these operations, Williams picked up the Mezzotint from the table without looking at it, and handed it to a person mildly interested in art, telling him where it had come from, and the other particulars which we already know. The gentleman took it carelessly, looked at it, then said, in a tone of some interest, "It's really a very good piece of work, Williams. It has quite the feeling of the Romantic period. The light is admirably managed, it seems to me, and the figure, though it's rather too grotesque, is somehow very impressive." "Yes, isn't it?" said Williams, who was just then busy giving whisky and soda to others of the company, and was unable to come across the room to look at the view again. It was by this time rather late in the evening, and the visitors were on the move. As they went, Williams was obliged to write a letter or two and clear up some odd bits of work. At last, some time past midnight, he was disposed to turn in, and he put out his lamp after lighting his bedroom candle. The picture lay face upwards on the table where the last man who looked at it had put it, and it caught his eye as he turned the lamp down. What he saw very nearly made him drop the candle on the floor, and he declares now that if he had been left in the dark at that moment, he would have had a fit. It was indubitable, rankly impossible no doubt, but absolutely certain. In the middle of the lawn, in front of the unknown house, there was a figure, where no figure had been at 5 o'clock that afternoon. It was crawling on all 4s towards the house, and it was muffled in a strange black garment with a white cross on the back. I do not know what is the ideal course to pursue in a situation of this kind. I can only tell you what Mr. Williams did. He took the picture by one corner and carried it across the passage to a second set of rooms which he possessed. There he locked it up in a drawer, sported the doors of both sets of rooms, and retired to bed. But first he wrote out and signed an account of the extraordinary change that the picture had undergone since it had come into his possession. Sleep visited him rather late, but it was consoling to reflect that the behaviour of the picture did not depend upon his own unsupported testimony. He must take stock of the picture very carefully and call in a witness for the purpose, and he must make a determined effort to ascertain what house it was that was represented. He would therefore ask his neighbour Nesbit to breakfast with him, and he would subsequently spend a morning over the gazetteer. Nisbet was disengaged, and arrived about 9:30. I am bound to say that Williams was rather distraught, for his interest naturally centred in that very strange picture which was now reposing, face downwards, in the drawer in the opposite room. The morning pipe was at last lighted, and the moment had arrived for which he looked. With very considerable, almost tremulous excitement, he ran across, unlocked the drawer, and, extracting the picture, still face downwards, ran back and put it into Nesbit's hands. "Now," he said, "Nisbet, I want you to tell me exactly what you see in that picture. Describe it, if you don't mind, rather minutely. I will tell you why afterwards." "Well," said Nisbet, "I have here a view of a country house. English, I presume, by moonlight?" "Moonlight? You're sure of that?" "Certainly. The moon appears to be on the wane, if you wish for details, and there are clouds in the sky." "All right, go on." "I swear," added Williams in an aside, "there was no moon when I saw it first." "Well, there's not much more to be said," Nisbet continued. "The house has 1, 2, 3 rows of windows, 5 in each row, except at the bottom, where there's a porch instead of the middle one, and—" "But what about the figures?" said Williams with marked interest. "There aren't any," said Nisbet, "but—" "What? No figure on the grass in front?" "Not a thing." "You'll swear to that?" "Certainly I will. But there's just one other thing." "What?" "Why, one of the windows on the ground floor, left of the door, is open." "Is that really so? My goodness, he must have got in," said Williams with great excitement, and hurried to the back of the sofa on which Nisbet was sitting, and, catching the picture from him, verified the matter for himself. It was quite true. There was no figure, and there was the open window. Williams, after a moment of speechless surprise, went to the writing table and scribbled for a short time. Then he brought 2 papers to Nisbet, and asked him first to sign one — it was his own description of the picture, which you have just heard — and then to read the other, which was Williams's statement, written the night before. "What can it all mean?" said Nisbet. "Exactly," said Williams. "Well, one thing I must do, or 3 things now I think of it. I must find out from Garwood," this was his last night's visitor, "what he saw, and then I must get the thing photographed before it goes further, and then I must find out what the place is." "I can do the photographing myself," said Nisbet, "and I will. But, you know, it looks very much as if we were assisted at the working out of a tragedy somewhere. The question is, has it happened already, or is it going to come off? You must find out what this place is." "Yes," he said, looking at the picture again. "I expect you're right. He has got in, and if I don't mistake, there'll be the devil to pay in one of the rooms upstairs." "I'll tell you what," said Williams. "I'll take the picture to old Green." This was the senior fellow of the college who had been bursar for many years. "It's quite likely he'll know it. We have properties in Essex and Sussex, and he must have been over the 2 counties a lot in his time." "Quite likely he will," said Nesbit. "But just let me take my photograph first. And look here, I rather think Green isn't up today. He wasn't in Hall last night, and I think I heard him say he was going down for the Sunday." "That's true too," said Williams. "I know he's gone to Brighton. Well, if you'll photograph it now, I'll go across to Garwood and get his statement, and you keep an eye on it while I'm gone. I'm beginning to think 2 guineas is not a very exorbitant price for it now." In a short time he had returned, and brought Mr. Garwood with him. Garwood's statement was to the effect that the figure, when he had seen it, was clear of the edge of the picture, but had not got far across the lawn. He remembered the white mark on the back of its drapery, but could not have been sure it was a cross. A document to this effect was drawn up and signed, and Nisbet proceeded to photograph the picture. "Now what do you mean to do?" he said. "Are you going to sit and watch it all day?" "Well, no, I think not," said Williams. "I rather imagine we're meant to see the whole thing. You see, between the time I saw it last night and this morning, there was time for lots of things to happen, but the creature only got into the house. It could easily have got through its business in the time and gone to its own place again, but the fact of the window being open, I think, must mean that it's in there now. So I feel quite easy about leaving it. And besides, I have a kind of an idea that it wouldn't change much if at all in the daytime. I shall leave it out on the table here and sport the door. My skip can get in, but no one else." The three agreed that this would be a good plan, and further, that if they spent the afternoon together they would be less likely to talk about the business to other people, for any rumour of such a transaction as was going on would be likely to bring the whole of the Phasmatological Society about their ears. We may give them a respite until 5 o'clock. At or near that hour the three were entering Williams's staircase. They were at first slightly annoyed to see that the door of his room was unsported, but in a moment it was remembered that on Sunday the skips came for orders an hour or so earlier than on weekdays. However, a surprise was awaiting them. The first thing they saw was the picture leaning up against a pile of books on the table, as it had been left, and the next thing was Williams's skip, seated on a chair opposite, gazing at it with undisguised horror. He started violently when the three were in the room, and got up with a marked effort. Then he said, "I ask your pardon, sir, for taking such a freedom as to set down." "Not at all, Robert," interposed Mr. Williams. "I was meaning to ask you some time what you thought of that picture." "Well, sir, of course I don't set up my opinion again yours, but it ain't the picture I should hang where my little girl could see it, sir. Should you be wanting anything else this evening, sir?" "Thank you, sir." With these words the man went to continue the round of his masters, and you may be sure the gentleman he left lost no time in gathering round the engraving. There was the house, as before, under the waning moon and the drifting clouds. The window that had been open was shut, and the figure was once more on the lawn, but not this time crawling cautiously on hands and knees. Now it was erect and stepping swiftly, with long strides, towards the front of the picture. The moon was behind it, and the black drapery hung down over its face so that only hints of that could be seen, and what was visible made the spectators profoundly thankful that they could see no more than a white, dome-like forehead and a few straggling hairs. The head was bent down, and the arms were tightly clasped over an object which could be dimly seen and identified as a child, whether dead or living it was impossible to say. The legs of the appearance alone could be plainly discerned, and they were horribly thin. From 5 to 7 the three companions sat and watched the picture by turns, but it never changed. They agreed at last that it would be safe to leave it, and that they would return after Hall and await further developments. When they assembled again at the earliest possible moment, the engraving was there, but the figure was gone, and the house was quiet under the moonbeams. There was nothing for it but to spend the evening over gazetteers and guidebooks. Williams was the lucky one at last, and perhaps he deserved it. At 11:30 p.m. he read from Murray's Guide to Essex the following lines. 16.5 miles, Anningley. The church has been an interesting building of Norman date, but was extensively classicised in the last century. It contains the tomb of the family of Francis, whose mansion, Anningley Hall, a solid Queen Anne house, stands immediately beyond the churchyard in a park of about 80 acres. The family is now extinct, the last heir having disappeared mysteriously in infancy in the year 1802. The father, Mr. Arthur Francis, was locally known as a talented amateur engraver in Mezzotint. After his son's disappearance he lived in complete retirement at the Hall, and was found dead in his studio on the 3rd anniversary of the disaster, having just completed an engraving of the house, impressions of which are of considerable rarity. This looked like business, and indeed Mr. Green on his return at once identified the house as Anningley Hall. "Is there any kind of explanation for the figure, Green?" was the question which Williams naturally asked. "I don't know, I'm sure, Williams. What used to be said in the place when I first knew it was just this. Old Francis was always very much down on these poaching fellows, and whenever he got the chance he used to get a man whom he suspected of it turned off the estate, and by degrees he got rid of them all but one. Squires could do a lot of things that they daren't think of now. Well, this man that was left was what you find pretty often in that country. The last remains of a very old family. I believe they were lords of the manor at one time. I recollect just the same thing in my own parish." "What, like the man from Tess of the d'Urbervilles?" Williams put in. "Yes, I dare say. It's not a book I could ever read myself. But this fellow could show a row of tombs in the church there that belonged to his ancestors, and all that went to sour him a bit. But Francis, they said, could never get at him. He always kept just on the right side of the law, until one night the keepers found him at it in a wood right at the end of the estate, and you can imagine there was a row. And this man, Gordy, that was his name to be sure, Gordy, he was unlucky enough, poor chap, to shoot a keeper. Well, that was all Francis wanted. Poor Gordy was strung up in double quick time. And I've been shown the place he was buried on the north side of the church. You know the way in that part of the world. Anyone that's been hanged or made away with themselves, they bury them that side. And the idea was that some friend of Gordy's, not a relation because he had none, poor devil, he was the last of his line, kind of spes ultima genus, must have planned to get hold of Francis's boy and put an end to his line too. I don't know. It's rather an out-of-the-way thing for an Essex poacher to think of. But you know, I should say now it looks more as if old Gordy had managed the job himself. Boo! Hate to think of it. The facts were communicated by Williams to Denniston, and by him to a mixed company of which I was one. I have only to add that the picture is now in the Ashleigham Museum, that it has been treated with a view of discovering whether sympathetic ink has been used, but without effect, that Mr. Britnell knew nothing of it save that he was sure it was uncommon, and that, though carefully watched, it has ever been known to change again. I hope you've enjoyed this exploration of M.R. James and this abridged reading of the Mezzotint. If you enjoyed, please do like, share, subscribe for more in the future, and until next time, see ya. Oh, and don't try to blow strange whistles you find on the beach. You never know what you might call up.